The eviction notice hit the porch like a gunshot. Dale Hutchins didn't knock, didn't call ahead. He climbed out of his black truck, walked straight to Maeve Holloway's front door, and nailed the paper to the wood with a single hammer blow, loud enough to wake the whole valley if there had been anyone left to hear it. Then he turned around and smiled at his men. "She's got 72 hours, he said. "After that, we take what's ours." Maeve was standing inside the doorway when he said it. He knew she was there. He smiled because she was there. If you discovered that everything your husband built, every fence post, every acre, every year of sacrifice, had been stolen from you with a pen stroke and a forged signature, what would you do? Would you leave, or would you fight? If this kind of story moves you, stories about ordinary people who refuse to be broken, please subscribe to this channel and follow Maeve's story all the way to the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Dale Hutchins came to take the ranch, Maeve Holloway had not slept in 31 hours. She wasn't proud of that. She wasn't particularly proud of anything those days. Not the dishes that had been sitting in the basin since Tuesday. Not the notebook she kept meaning to write in and never did. Not the way she sometimes caught herself talking to Thomas in the empty kitchen like he'd just stepped out to check the water troughs and would be back any minute. Thomas had been dead for 4 months, 2 weeks, and 3 days. She knew the exact count because she'd stopped sleeping the night it happened and had not quite managed to put herself back together since. The Holloway Ranch sat at the end of a gravel road that most people in Cutler County didn't bother learning. 1,100 acres of Montana grassland folded into the base of the Bitterroot Range, with a creek that ran cold until July and a barn that tilted slightly to the east because Thomas had built the foundation himself and gotten it wrong on the first try and never quite fixed it right. Maeve had always meant to nag him about that barn. Now she would have given anything to hear him defend it one more time. The ranch wasn't beautiful in any way that photographs could capture. The house needed paint. 2 of the pasture fences had been sagging since spring. The east field had gone unplanted because there was no one left to plant it. But it was hers. It was hers and Thomas's. And they had spent 19 years making it exactly what it was. Imperfect, stubborn, alive. She was standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee gone cold when the black truck turned up the drive. She didn't recognize it at first. There were 2 trucks, actually, one black, one silver, and 4 men between them. They wore clean clothes, which already told her something. Nobody who worked honest land showed up with clean boots at 7 in the morning. The man who climbed out of the black truck first was Dale Hutchins, though Maeve wouldn't learn his name for another 10 minutes. He was somewhere in his 50s, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of comfortable confidence that came from never having been told no by anyone who mattered. He had a leather folder tucked under one arm and a small hammer in his other hand, and he walked to her front door like the property already belonged to him. She heard the hammer strike once. She set down her coffee cup. She opened the door. The paper was still shaking from the impact, nailed just above the handle where she couldn't miss it. Official looking. Stamped with a seal from something called Pinnacle Land Holdings, LLC. She pulled it free without reading past the first line, because the first line was enough. Notice of default and foreclosure. Holloway Ranch property, Cutler County, Montana. Mrs. Holloway. Dale Hutchins said her name like it was a formality he had already moved past. I'm going to need you to understand that this is a legal process. It doesn't have to be difficult. Maeve looked at him. Then she looked at the paper. Then she looked back at him. My husband never borrowed against this land, she said. Ma'am, the paperwork... My husband never borrowed against this land, she said again, slower this time. Not louder. Slower. Like she was explaining something to someone who had trouble understanding simple sentences. Hutchins opened the leather folder and held it out toward her. Inside were what looked like official loan documents. Signatures, dates, notary stamps. Everything perfectly in order except for the fact that Thomas Holloway had been dead before half those dates. And Maeve knew it, and she suspected on some level that Hutchins knew she knew it. The loan was executed 14 months ago, Hutchins said. The payment schedule was not met. Under the terms of the agreement, give me that. She took the folder from him before he finished the sentence. She stood right there on her own porch in her worn-out boots, and her husband's old flannel shirt, and she read every line of those documents with Hutchins and his 3 men watching her do it. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed that. She thought maybe they should be. The signature on the loan agreement looked like Thomas's handwriting. It really did. Whoever had done it was skilled enough to get the general shape right. The slight backward lean of the capital letters, the way the H looped too wide at the bottom. Skilled enough to fool a banker, probably. Skilled enough to fool a judge, maybe. But not skilled enough to fool her. Thomas had broken the ring finger on his right hand the summer he was 23, catching it wrong in a fence post auger. It had healed crooked, and he had written with a slight compensating hook in his downstrokes ever since, something so small and automatic that he'd never even mentioned it himself. Maeve had noticed it the first time she watched him sign a birthday card. The signature on these documents had no hook. It was close. It was very close. But it had no hook. "I want you off my property," Maeve said. She handed the folder back to Hutchins without ceremony. "Right now. Today." Something flickered across Hutchins' face. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. He had expected tears, she realized. He had expected collapse. He had driven up here expecting to watch a tired, grieving widow fold like a paper bag in the rain. "Mrs. Holloway?" His voice had shifted now. Still smooth, but with something harder underneath. "You have 72 hours to vacate voluntarily. After that, we have legal authority to... You have legal authority to get off my land in the next 30 seconds, she said. "After that, I'm going to call Sheriff Briggs, and I'm going to stand here and watch you explain to him why you nailed a fraudulent document to my door." The word fraudulent landed in the air between them, like a stone dropped in still water. Hutchins smiled, and that smile, patient, indulgent, the smile of a man who had done this before and always won, that smile was somehow the most infuriating thing Maeve had seen in 4 months. "Call whoever you like," he said. He took the folder back. He walked to his truck without hurry. He said something to the other men too quietly for her to hear, and 2 of them laughed, and they drove away. Maeve stood on her porch until the trucks were out of sight. Then she went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and pressed both palms flat against the surface like she was trying to keep the table from floating away. Her coffee was still there, still cold. The morning light was coming through the east window the way it always did, falling across the same floorboards it had fallen across for 19 years. Everything looked exactly the same. She thought about Thomas. She thought about the way he used to say, "We'll figure it out," before he'd even heard the whole problem. Like his confidence in their combined stubbornness was the only plan he ever needed. She thought, he would be furious right now. Then she thought, so am I. She pulled the notebook out from the kitchen drawer, the one she'd been pretending she might write in someday, and she opened it to the first page and she wrote, "Signatures don't match. Find originals." The first person she called was not Sheriff Briggs. Briggs was a decent man in the way that certain men are decent when decency costs them nothing. He showed up on time, he said the right things, and he had a handshake that people always described as reassuring. But Maeve had grown up in this county. She knew that Dale Hutchins had been photographed at Briggs's campaign fundraiser 2 years ago. She had seen the picture in the Cutler Courier and thought nothing of it at the time. She thought something of it now. The first person she called was her neighbor Rowena Greer, who was 74 years old, had survived 2 floods and 1 bankruptcy and 1 faithless husband, and who had the sharpest mind of anyone Maeve had ever met, despite the fact that Rowena described herself as just an old woman who likes chickens. Rowena answered on the second ring. "Someone just nailed a foreclosure notice to my door," Maeve said. "I need to talk to you." A pause. Then Rowena said, "I'll put the coffee on." Maeve drove the 6 miles to Rowena's place in 20 minutes. She brought the notebook. She brought the memory of that signature and the missing hook in the downstrokes. She did not bring Thomas's old flannel shirt because she had left it on the hook by the kitchen door, which was where it lived, and she was not ready to change that yet. Rowena's kitchen smelled like coffee and wood smoke and old paper, which was Maeve's favorite combination of smells in the world. Rowena poured 2 cups and sat down across the table, and Maeve explained everything. The trucks, the documents, the notary stamps, the signature that was almost Thomas's but not quite. Rowena listened without interrupting, which was one of her greatest gifts. When Maeve finished, Rowena said, "You're sure about the handwriting?" "I'm sure." "Because sure is different from almost sure when you're standing in front of a judge." "I know the difference," Maeve said. "I'm sure." Rowena looked at her for a long moment. "Then you need somebody who can prove it in a language the court will accept. A handwriting expert, a forensic examiner, somebody with letters behind their name who can stand up and say what you're telling me." "That costs money." "Yes, it does." Maeve wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. The ranch had money. Not a lot, but enough. Thomas had been careful. They'd been careful together. She thought about what it would cost to fight this properly, and then she thought about what it would cost to lose, and the math was not complicated. "Is there anything else?" Rowena asked. "Any other documents? Your original deed? Your property tax records? Anything with Thomas's actual signature that a court would recognize?" Maeve had been thinking about that the whole drive over. "The deed's in the house. So are the tax filings. And Thomas kept a ledger. Every expense, every payment, going back to when we bought the land. He was religious about that ledger." "Get all of it together tonight," Rowena said. "Everything with his name on it. And don't let any of it out of your sight." Maeve nodded. Then she said, because she had to say it to someone, "They're going to try to bury this. Whoever did this is connected enough to have official stamps and a notary signature and county records on their side. They're not going to back down because I said the handwriting is wrong." "No," Rowena agreed. "They're not. So what do I do?" Rowena looked at her with something that wasn't quite sympathy. It was more direct than sympathy, more useful. "You make the cost of burying it higher than the cost of losing," she said. "That's what you do." She drove back to the ranch in the late morning with Rowena's words sitting in her chest like something she hadn't decided what to do with yet. The road home was the same road it had always been. Gravel turning to dirt where the county maintenance stopped caring, then 2 tire tracks across the last half-mile that Thomas had worn into the grass over 19 years of driving the same route twice a day. She'd driven this road so many times she did it without thinking, which meant she had too much space in her mind for thinking about other things. She was thinking about the ledger. Thomas's handwriting in the ledger. Thousands of entries, 19 years of his actual signature and his actual numbers in his actual hand, including that small compensating hook in the downstrokes. Irrefutable. Original. Locked in a fireproof box under the floorboards of the bedroom closet because Thomas had read something once about house fires and had never quite gotten over it. She parked in the usual spot and walked to the front porch and stopped. There was a man fixing her fence, not the front fence, the long pasture fence along the north property line, the one that had been leaning at a 30-degree angle since the windstorm in April. He was about 200 yards out, working with his back to her, and he hadn't heard her drive in. He had a post hole digger and a pair of wire stretchers and the deliberate movements of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Maeve stood very still for a moment. Then she walked back to the truck, reached under the seat, and took out the rifle. She walked the 200 yards to the fence line with the rifle in the crook of her arm, not raised, not threatening, just present. The man didn't hear her until she was about 20 feet out, and when he turned around, she got her first real look at him. He was maybe 45, maybe a little older, weathered in the way that outdoor work does to a person, the kind of tan that didn't come from a beach. He had dark eyes and a week's worth of stubble and a work shirt that had been washed so many times the original color was a guess. He looked at her. He looked at the rifle. He looked back at her. He did not look frightened. He also did not look annoyed at being interrupted. He looked like a man who had gotten caught doing something he hadn't entirely thought through and was deciding how honest to be about it. "Your fence was down," he said. "I know my fence is down," Maeve said. "Who are you?" "Gideon Mercer. I've got the spread about 4 miles east." She knew the Mercer property by sight, though she'd never met the man. He'd bought it 2 years ago from old Pete Sievert and had apparently kept mostly to himself, which in Cutler County was either unremarkable or suspicious depending on your mood. "I didn't ask you to fix my fence," she said. "No," he agreed. "So why are you doing it?" He looked at the fence post he'd just set, then back at her. "It was bothering me." Maeve stared at him for a moment. "It was bothering you?" "Driving past it every day." He shrugged, a small gesture, uncomfortable. I've got the time. You've clearly got other things going. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She was used to offers of help that came packaged with advice she hadn't asked for, or opinions about what Thomas should have done, or the specific kind of sympathy that required her to be visibly suffering enough to justify someone else's goodwill. Gideon Mercer was just standing there with wire stretchers in his hand, looking like he wished she hadn't noticed. Do you know who Dale Hutchins is? She asked. Something shifted in his expression. Small, but there. I know who he is. He came here this morning with foreclosure papers. Gideon was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fence post again. You going to fight it? I'm going to do more than fight it, Maeve said. I'm going to take it apart. He studied her for a long moment with those dark, quiet eyes. She had the uncomfortable feeling of being accurately assessed by someone who didn't feel the need to comment on what he found. All right, he said finally, and turned back to the fence. She stood there a moment longer, not sure if she was dismissing him or he was dismissing her. Then she turned and walked back to the house with the rifle in her arm and the notebook in her head, and 19 years of her husband's handwriting locked under the closet floor. She had 72 hours. She had a missing hook and a downstroke. She had a neighbor who fixed things without being asked, and she didn't know yet whether that was a comfort or one more thing to be suspicious of. She went inside. She opened the notebook. She wrote the second line. Get a lawyer, a real one. Federal, not county. Outside, she could hear the faint sound of the post hole digger going back into the dirt. She didn't look up from the page. The fireproof box was exactly where Thomas had put it. Under the third floorboard from the left in the bedroom closet, behind the winter boots nobody had moved since October. Maeve had to get down on her knees to reach it, and her knees weren't what they used to be, and she was aware of that in the particular way you become aware of your body's complaints when there's no one around to pretend for anymore. The box was heavier than she remembered. Thomas had bought it from a catalog 11 years ago and made a small ceremony of explaining to her where it was hidden, as though she hadn't watched him cut up the floorboard herself. She had never told him she'd watched. He had seemed so satisfied with his own competence in that moment that correcting him would have been a small cruelty she wasn't willing to commit. She carried the box to the kitchen table and opened it with the key she kept on her own keyring, right next to the truck key, where it had lived for 11 years without her ever needing it. Inside, the deed. The original purchase agreement from 1987, property tax filings going back 14 years, and Thomas's ledger. A hardcover accounting book with a green cloth cover, worn soft at the corners, filled front to back in his dense, careful handwriting. He had filled 4 of them over 19 years. She had all 4. Every payment, every expense, every transaction the ranch had ever made, recorded in the hand of a man who wrote with a broken ring finger and compensated for it in a way so small and so automatic that he'd carried it to his grave without ever knowing it was there. She spread everything out on the table and spent 2 hours going through it. By the time the afternoon light started shifting, she had found something she hadn't expected to find. The loan documents Hutchins had shown her were dated 14 months ago. But Thomas's ledger from that period, which she had gone through line by line, month by month, showed no loan proceeds. No deposit of the kind of money you'd expect from the amount listed on those papers. No payments out. Nothing that looked even remotely like a man servicing a debt he'd taken on against his own property. A man might lie in a document. A man might even lie to his wife. But Thomas Holloway had recorded every single expense in that ledger, from the price of fence staples to the cost of a birthday dinner, and there was nothing that suggested he had borrowed $400,000 from a company called Pinnacle Land Holdings, LLC, and then quietly forgotten to mention it. She wrote in her notebook, no corresponding deposits or payments in ledger. Loan amount equals $400,000. No trace of funds received, no payments made. Either Thomas hid $400,000 somewhere impossible to hide, or it never happened. She underlined the last 4 words twice. She sat back in her chair and listened to the house. The refrigerator hummed. The clock above the door counted seconds. Outside, a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do in the late afternoon, entirely indifferent to the fact that Maeve Holloway's life was unraveling at the kitchen table. She was tired. She was more tired than she could remember being in years, including the weeks right after Thomas died, when tired had been a thing she wore like a second skin. But underneath the tired, there was something else now. Something she recognized from years ago, from the early days of the ranch when everything was harder than they'd planned and the bank was less patient than they'd hoped. And Thomas would say, "We'll figure it out." And she would be the one who actually figured it out, while he believed hard enough for both of them. She recognized the thing underneath the tired. It was the part of her that did not know how to stop. She picked up the phone and called information for federal attorneys in Billings. What? His name was Raymond Cutler. No relation to the county, he always said, though nobody ever believed him. He had practiced federal land law for 22 years out of a third-floor office in Billings that smelled like old coffee and had a view of a parking garage. He was not charming. He did not have the kind of reassuring handshake that Briggs had. He asked questions fast, and he wrote things down while you were still talking, and he had a habit of making a sound in the back of his throat, a short, non-committal that gave absolutely nothing away. Maeve drove the 2 hours to Billings the next morning with the fireproof box in the passenger seat and her notebook in her jacket pocket. She told Raymond Cutler everything in the order it happened without editorializing, because she had a feeling he was the kind of man who would ask her to back up and start over if she started making arguments before she'd finished laying out facts. When she was done, he made the sound in his throat and looked at his notes. "The ledger," he said. "You have it with you?" She put it on his desk. He spent 10 minutes going through it without speaking. She didn't try to fill the silence. She had learned, somewhere in the first year of marriage, that the ability to sit quietly in a room while someone else thought was underrated. "And your husband's signature," Cutler said. "You're telling me you can identify a distinguishing characteristic. A hook in the downstrokes, from a broken finger that healed wrong. I watched him write for 19 years. That's not evidence," he said. "Not unkindly, just factually. Not by itself. What that is a direction. A handwriting examiner, a qualified forensic document examiner, can take what you're describing and turn it into testimony that a federal court will actually hear." He looked up. "That costs money?" "I know. A full examination, an affidavit, possible court appearance, you're looking at several $1,000s before we get to my fees." "I know what I'm looking at," Maeve said. "My question is whether the case is worth making." Raymond Cutler leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the flat, measuring look of a man who had spent 2 decades in rooms full of people who were either right or wrong about the thing they were most certain of. "If the signature is forged," he said, "and the ledger shows what you're telling me it shows, and there are no corresponding financial records supporting the existence of this loan, then yes, you have a case." He paused. "But I want to be direct with you, Mrs. Holloway. Pinnacle Land Holdings is not a small operation. They have attorneys, they have relationships. They have apparently access to official notary stamps and county filing systems, which means they have someone on the inside of at least one government office. The legal fight you're describing is not a simple one." "I didn't come here because I thought it would be simple," Maeve said. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he wrote something on his notepad and turned it around so she could see. It was a number. His retainer. It was significant. "Can you cover this?" he asked. She looked at the number. She thought about Thomas's ledger, 19 years of careful accounting. She thought about the savings account they'd built together. Enough, Thomas had always said, to handle the next disaster, whatever it turned out to be. She pulled out her checkbook. "One condition," she said as she wrote. "What's that?" "You don't make decisions without telling me first. Not strategy, not settlement offers, not anything. I'm not a bystander in my own case." Raymond Cutler took the check and looked at it and set it on his desk. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, and for the first time something in his voice shifted slightly. Not warmth exactly, but recognition, the sound of a man recalibrating. "That is exactly the kind of client I prefer." She drove home with the fireproof box still in the passenger seat and a manila folder of Raymond Cutler's preliminary paperwork on top of it, and she was 40 minutes from home when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but she was running on instinct more than caution just then, and her instinct said pick up. "Mrs. Holloway." A man's voice, older, dry as paper. My name is Harold Finch. I was deputy clerk at the Cutler County Land Office for 17 years. I retired in February. She waited. I heard about your situation, he said. I heard this morning. Word gets around in a small county. What do you want, Mr. Finch? A pause. I want to tell you something I should have said before I retired and didn't. I'd like to meet. She pulled the truck to the side of the road. Tell me where, she said. He named a diner in a small town 20 miles west of Cutler, the kind of place that has been there long enough that nobody remembers when it opened, and said he could be there in an hour. She said she'd be there in 45 minutes. She was there in 38. Harold Finch was already in a corner booth when she arrived. A thin man in his late 60s with reading glasses pushed up on his head, and the particular look of someone who has made a decision they're not entirely comfortable with. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that he hadn't touched. He watched her walk across the diner with the careful attention of a man who is trying to assess whether he has made a mistake. She sat down across from him and didn't say anything. He picked up his coffee cup. Put it down. About 8 months before your husband passed, he said quietly, someone accessed the physical land records for the Holloway property. The original deed filing, the survey documents, everything in the paper archive. The access was logged under a maintenance request, which is a routine thing. We pulled old files for scanning, for updates. Except I checked afterward and nothing was actually updated. Nothing was scanned. The files were accessed and returned and nothing on paper indicated why. Maeve's hand was flat on the table. She pressed it down slightly, feeling the formica. Did you report it? She asked. I raised it with my supervisor. He looked at his coffee again. My supervisor was Doug Prager. Doug Prager is Dale Hutchins' brother-in-law. The diner was quiet around them. A few other customers, the sound of the kitchen, a radio playing something country and indifferent. The world going about its business while Harold Finch sat in a corner booth and told her the shape of the thing she was already beginning to understand. What happened when you raised it? She said. I was told the access was routine and I should focus on my own responsibilities. He looked up at her. 2 weeks later, I was offered early retirement at a number that made it very clear the offer wouldn't be made twice. And you took it. He met her eyes. He didn't look away, which she respected. I have a wife with a bad hip and a fixed income, and I was 67 years old, he said. So, yes, I took it. Maeve looked at him for a long moment. And now you're telling me. Now I'm telling you. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his shirt pocket and put it on the table between them. I kept a copy of the access log, my personal copy from when I was still trying to decide what to do about it. I know I should have given it to someone months ago. She looked at the paper. She did not pick it up yet. Why me? She asked. Why now? Because you're the third one, Harold Finch said. She looked at him. Third what? Third widow in this county in 4 years to get foreclosure papers from Pinnacle Land Holdings on property that never had a loan against it. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The first two gave up. One moved to her daughter's place in Idaho. The other took a settlement, signed papers, kept quiet, lost her land. I thought maybe they were isolated situations. I told myself that. He shook his head. You're not isolated. You're a pattern. And if I don't say something now, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to live with myself much longer, pretending I don't know what I know. Maeve picked up the access log. She read it twice. She put it in her jacket pocket next to her notebook. I'm going to need you to be willing to say this in front of an attorney, she said. Possibly in front of a judge. Harold Finch nodded. He looked frightened. He also looked, she thought, like a man who had been frightened for 8 months and was tired of it. That's why I called, he said. She didn't go straight home. She drove to Rowena's first because Rowena needed to hear what Harold Finch had said, and because Maeve needed to say it out loud to someone she trusted before she let herself start fully believing the size of what she was looking at. Rowena listened the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, with her hands folded around her own coffee cup and her eyes on Maeve's face. When Maeve finished, Rowena said, 3 widows. That we know of. That you know of, Rowena said, but Harold Finch knew about 2, which means there's a record somewhere, even if it's buried. She unfolded herself from her chair and went to the kitchen counter where she kept a battered address book that was so old the cover had been taped back on twice. I know somebody, she said. Ellen Marsh. She lost her place 3 years ago. The double R. Out past the Whitmore Road. She didn't fight it, but she never stopped being angry about it. Rowena found the number and wrote it on a piece of paper and handed it to Maeve. I'm going to call her tonight. You should talk to her yourself. Did you know her well? Well enough that she'll answer if I tell her it matters. Rowena sat back down. Who else do you have besides the attorney and Harold Finch? I have Thomas's ledger. I have the deed and the tax records. I have a forensic document examiner that Cutler is arranging. Maeve spread her hands on Rowena's kitchen table. And I have about 71 hours left on a deadline that doesn't mean anything legally if the case is fraudulent, but will absolutely get complicated if I'm still living on the property when they decide to escalate. You're staying on the property, Rowena said. It wasn't a question. I'm staying on the property. Rowena nodded like that settled something. Then here's what you need to know about Ellen Marsh, she said. She kept everything. Every letter they sent her. Every document, every envelope, every postmark. Ellen is the kind of woman who does not throw things away under any circumstances, which her late husband found maddening and which is now going to be very useful to you. Maeve wrote Ellen Marsh's name in her notebook under the words she'd written the night before. The list was growing. She drove home in the dark, which she had been doing her whole adult life on roads she knew by feel, and she was almost at the turnoff to her own drive when the headlights caught something. She slowed the truck. Gideon Mercer's horse was tied to her fence post at the end of the drive, which meant Gideon Mercer was somewhere on her property in the dark, and for one sharp second she felt the rifle's absence from under the seat before she remembered she'd left it in the house. She parked. She got out. She called his name, not loudly, into the dark. Up here. His voice came from the direction of the barn. She walked toward it, and in the last reach of the truck's headlights, she could see him standing at the barn door, which was standing open. The barn light, the single bare bulb Thomas had wired in 1994, was on. She walked to him. What are you doing? Your barn door lock was broken, he said. The latch assembly. If a wind comes through tonight, the door's going to bang itself apart. He held up a new latch, the kind you buy at any feed store, nothing fancy, $3 and some change. I had one in my truck. It took about 15 minutes. She looked at the latch. She looked at him. In the bare yellow light of the barn, he looked tired, she thought. Not the kind of tired that comes from a long day, but the kind that goes deeper. She recognized it because she wore it herself. Why are you doing this? She said. And don't tell me the latch was bothering you. He was quiet for a moment. He turned the new latch once, checking it, before he answered. I was in a situation myself a while back, he said. Different situation. Somebody helped me when they didn't have to. I've been trying to figure out ever since what I'm supposed to do with that. It was not the answer she had expected. She didn't know what to do with it, except file it next to everything else she was figuring out. I'm not going to ask you to keep coming around, she said. I don't know you. Fair enough. But I'm going to ask you one thing. She looked at him directly. Do you know anything about Pinnacle Land Holdings? Anything at all? He was quiet for a beat longer than she would have liked. I've heard the name, he said. From where? Pete Sievert, he said. The man I bought my property from. He said they'd approached him twice trying to buy him out at below market value. He said no both times. He said the third time they approached him, they stopped asking politely. Maeve felt something cold move through her. What happened? He sold, Gideon said. To me. At a fair price, because I was there with cash and a straight offer at exactly the moment he wanted out. He didn't tell me why he wanted out until the papers were signed, and I'd already moved in. He looked at her steadily. I don't know if that connects to your situation, but I thought you should know. Did Pete Sievert keep any documentation? Any letters from Pinnacle? Anything in writing? I don't know. He went to Tucson. He paused. I have a phone number for him. She took out her notebook. She opened it. She looked at the growing list of names. Write it down, she said. He did. His handwriting was small and even and had no distinguishing characteristics she could identify from a single phone number, but she noticed it anyway, the way she noticed everything now. She tore the page out carefully and put it in her jacket pocket with the access log from Harold Finch and the manila folder from Raymond Cutler. Gideon untied his horse from the fence post. He swung up without fuss, the way a person does when they've been doing it all their life. The horse shifted once and settled. "You going to be all right tonight?" he asked. She thought about the question seriously, the way he'd asked it. He hadn't asked it the way people usually asked, not meaning "are you going to cry" or "do you need company," but something more literal, more practical. "I'm going to be on the phone until midnight and up again at 5, she said. "So probably not comfortable, but all right." He nodded. "I'll check on the east pasture fence tomorrow morning," he said. "If that's okay." She thought about saying no. She thought about the instinct she'd spent 40 years building that said, "You don't need help, you handle things. You don't let strangers close enough to be wrong about them." "Before 7, she said. "I've got calls starting at 7. He rode out into the dark, and she stood at the barn door and listened until she couldn't hear the horse anymore. Then she went inside, made herself a sandwich she only half ate, and sat down at the kitchen table with the notebook and the access log and the phone number for Pete Sievert in Tucson. The list in the notebook now had 7 items on it, 7 threads, each one connecting to the next. Harold Finch and the accessed records, Ellen Marsh and the double R, Pete Sievert in Tucson, Raymond Cutler in Billings, Rowena and the address book, Thomas's ledger with 19 years of unimpeachable handwriting, and Gideon Mercer, who fixed things without being asked and apparently had his own connection to the web she was pulling on. She wrote an 8th item at the bottom of the list. Who else did they do this to? She circled it. Then she picked up the phone and started making calls. Pete Sievert answered on the 4th ring, which Maeve took as a sign that old ranchers in Tucson kept the same hours as old ranchers in Montana, regardless of what the clock said. "Who is this?" he said, not unfriendly, just direct. The voice of a man who had lived long enough to stop pretending phone calls were social occasions. "My name is Maeve Holloway. I own a ranch in Cutler County. Gideon Mercer gave me your number." A pause. She heard what sounded like a television being turned down. "Gideon's a good man," Pete said. Then, "What do you need?" "Pinnacle Land Holdings," she said. "I need to know everything you remember about your dealings with them." The pause this time was longer. She heard him breathe. "They came to me 3 times, he said finally. "First time was polite, second time less so. Third time a man sat across my kitchen table and told me that the county had found some irregularities in my property filings from the early 90s, and that it might be in my best interest to simplify my situation before things got complicated." He stopped. "I'd filed everything correct, always had. I knew what he was telling me." "Did you keep any of the correspondence, letters, anything in writing from Pinnacle?" "I kept the first letter, the formal offer letter. I've got it in a box somewhere in my garage." He paused again. "Why? What did they do to you?" She told him. The condensed version, the foreclosure notice, the forged signatures, the loan that never existed, Harold Finch and the accessed land records. When she finished, Pete Sievert made a sound that was not quite a word but communicated something ancient and weary and furious. "Lord," he said, then caught himself. "I sold my land because I was old and tired and scared, and I have been angry about that every day since." Another breath. "Find the letter? Give me a day." "I've got less than 70 hours, she said. "Then give me tonight," he said. "I'll tear that garage apart if I have to." She thanked him and hung up and sat for a moment in the kitchen with the clock ticking above the door and the dark pressing against every window and the ranch breathing around her the way it always had. The particular creaks and settlings of a house that has been lived in long enough to have its own rhythms. She was tired enough to put her head on the table and sleep sitting up. She was also too wired to sleep at all. She called Ellen Marsh instead. Rowena had called Ellen first to clear the way, so when Maeve introduced herself, Ellen already knew the name and wasted no time getting to what mattered. She was 63, had lived on the double R for 31 years with her husband before he died, and had received foreclosure papers from Pinnacle Land Holdings 14 months after his death, 18 months ago now. She had signed the settlement because she had no money for an attorney, and no one had told her there was another option. "Did you keep the documents?" Maeve asked, because Rowena had told her to ask. Honey, Ellen Marsh said, and her voice had the particular flatness of a woman who has been angry for so long, the anger has become a resting state. I kept every single piece of paper they ever sent me. Every envelope. I kept the box the first letter came in. I have a file cabinet in my spare bedroom, and every drawer is labeled. Maeve closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Can you get those to an attorney in Billings? I have a federal attorney named Raymond Cutler who needs to see them. I can drive them there myself, Ellen said. I've been waiting for someone to ask. They talked for another 30 minutes. Ellen described her own experience with the forged documents. The same notary stamp, she thought, though she hadn't known to look for it specifically, and the same pattern of an impossible loan against a property with no corresponding financial record. Her husband's signature, she said, had looked right to everyone who'd seen it. She hadn't known how to articulate what was wrong until now, listening to Maeve describe the hook in Thomas's downstrokes, at which point Ellen went very quiet and then said, My husband's left hand was his writing hand. The papers they showed me had a right-handed signature. Maeve wrote it down, added it to the list. A left-handed man with a right-handed signature. After she hung up, she sat with that for a while. Whoever was doing this was working from physical descriptions, basic information, not intimate knowledge. They knew enough to approximate a signature's general appearance, but not enough to know which hand a man used or how a broken finger changed the angle of a downstroke, which meant they were working from official records. Public filings. Things anyone could access if they had a reason to look, and the right kind of access to the county land office. She wrote in her notebook, Forger working from official records only. No access to private correspondence or intimate knowledge of subjects. Documents were filed with county. Check filing dates against Harold Finch's access log. She underlined that last part and drew a line connecting it to Harold Finch's name on the previous page. It was after midnight. She had been awake for 40 hours. She went to bed without undressing, which she had not done since the night Thomas died, and she was asleep before she had time to feel guilty about it. Gideon arrived before 7, as she'd asked, and she heard his truck on the gravel while she was still pulling on her boots. She had slept 4 hours and felt like someone had cleaned her with sandpaper, but she'd had worse mornings, and at least today she knew what she was doing. She put coffee on and went outside. He was already at the east pasture fence, which needed a new post about 30 yards in, and he had the tools out before she reached him. You didn't have to bring the post hole digger, she said. The posts rotted through. You knew that. I knew it. She handed him one of the 2 coffees she'd carried out. He took it without making it into a moment. She appreciated that. I talked to Pete Sievert last night. He looked at her over the coffee cup. And? She told him what Pete had said. The 3 visits, the implied threat about property filing irregularities. The letter Pete was looking for in his Tucson garage. Then she told him about Ellen Marsh and the left-handed signature. Gideon was quiet while he processed it. He'd set the coffee down and was working the digger, and there was something useful about talking to someone who was doing something physical at the same time. It took the pressure off the conversation, left room for thinking. So they're running a system, he said finally, not opportunistic, organized. Organized enough to need someone inside the county land office. Harold Finch confirmed the access to my records, and based on what Ellen described, they did the same thing with hers. I'd bet anything that if we pull the access logs for the R property, we'll find the same pattern. Gideon drove the new post into the prepared hole and tamped the earth around it before he spoke again. Harold Finch's supervisor, he said. The brother-in-law. Doug Prager. He's still with the county land office? As far as I know. He looked at the fence post he'd just set. So your evidence trail includes a current county employee who has motive to see it disappear. Which is exactly why I called Raymond Cutler at 6:45 this morning and told him that before anything gets filed anywhere, he needs to make copies of everything I have and get them to a federal office, not a county one. She looked at him. Cutler says if we can show a pattern, multiple properties, multiple forged documents, a county official facilitating access to records, we have grounds for a federal fraud investigation, not just a civil lawsuit, criminal. Gideon straightened up and looked at her steadily. She was never quite sure, in those long pauses of his, whether he was deciding what to say or deciding whether to say anything at all. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Pete Sievert's letter, when he finds it, and anything else he told you about his dealings with Pinnacle that he didn't put in that phone conversation." "He told me one other thing," Gideon said. "The man who came the third time, the one who sat in Pete's kitchen and talked about filing irregularities, Pete described him to me once. Younger, corporate-looking, drove a company truck." He paused. "Pete said the man had a Pinnacle Land Holdings business card. Said the name on the card was Garrett Voss, operations director." Maeve wrote it down. She had a name now. Not just Hutchins, who was the hammer. Voss, who was apparently the hand that held it. "I'm going into town this afternoon," she said. "I need to file something at the county clerk's office. Cutler wants a formal dispute notice on record before the 72 hours runs out, even if it's just a holding action. And I want to look at whoever is working the front desk at the land office when I walk in. I want to see their face when I say my name." Gideon picked up his coffee again. "You want company?" She thought about it honestly, which was not always something she was in the habit of doing where other people's offers were concerned. She thought about walking into the Cutler County offices alone, with a fraudulent foreclosure notice and a notebook full of threads that all pointed at someone inside that building. She thought about how she would look, a widow in worn boots, alone, 72-hour deadline, no court order yet. "Yes," she said. It cost her something to say it, but she said it straight. "Not because I can't do it alone, because two people are harder to intimidate than one, and I want them to understand that I am not alone." He nodded. No comment on the qualification. She appreciated that too. The Cutler County Administrative Building sat on the main square of Cutler, next to the courthouse, and across from a hardware store that had been in the same family since before Maeve was born. She had been in this building dozens of times over the years. Property taxes, water rights filings, the usual bureaucratic maintenance of owning land. She knew the smell of the hallway, the sound the floor made, the way the afternoon light came through the west-facing windows. She had never walked in before knowing that someone inside it had helped steal from her. She and Gideon walked in at 2:30. She had the formal dispute notice that Raymond Cutler had drafted, signed, and faxed to her that morning, along with certified copies of the original deed and the most recent property tax filing in Thomas's name. Everything legal and properly formatted, everything Raymond had said she needed. The clerk at the front desk of the land records office was a woman in her 40s named Donna, who Maeve had spoken to maybe twice before about tax filings. Donna looked up when they walked in, and her face did something complicated in the first half second. Not quite recognition, not quite surprise. Something that looked like a person trying to decide how to arrange their expression and running out of time. "Mrs. Holloway," Donna said, carefully, "I need to file a formal dispute notice against a foreclosure claim on the Holloway Ranch property," Maeve said. She put the documents on the counter. "My attorney has already been in contact with the Federal Land Registry office in Helena. These are certified copies. I need the originals stamped and returned." Donna looked at the documents, looked at Maeve, looked briefly at Gideon, who was standing a half step behind Maeve and slightly to the right, and was simply present in the way that a very solid, very calm person is present, which in Maeve's experience was the most effective kind of presence in a room where someone wanted to make you feel small. "I'll need to check with my supervisor," Donna said. "That's fine," Maeve said. "I'll wait." Donna went through a door behind the counter. Maeve stood at the counter and did not look at Gideon and did not check her watch. 30 seconds, a minute, 90 seconds. The door opened again, and a man came out who was not Donna. He was 50 or so, thick through the middle, with the specific kind of bureaucratic authority that lives in how slowly a person moves. He looked at Maeve with a flat, professional expression and held out his hand for the documents. "I'm Doug Prager," he said. "Deputy Director." Maeve looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about Harold Finch in the diner saying my supervisor was Doug Prager, Hutchins' brother-in-law. She thought about the access log in her jacket pocket. She did not shake his hand. "The documents are on the counter," she said. "I need them stamped and returned." Something moved behind Prager's eyes. A quick calculation, quickly suppressed. He picked up the documents without comment. He read through them with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent years handling paper. He stamped them. He made copies. He returned the originals. "Is there anything else?" he said, in the tone of a man who very much hopes there isn't. "Not today," Maeve said. She took the stamped documents and put them in the folder she'd carried in. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Prager." She and Gideon walked out. On the sidewalk outside, Gideon said, "He knew who you were before he came out." "Yes, he did." "And he still stamped the documents." "Because he had no legal grounds not to, and he knew it." She put the folder under her arm. "But now he's going to call someone. Hutchins, Voss, whoever runs Pinnacle from the top. He's going to tell them I have an attorney and I filed a formal dispute and I'm not going quietly." She looked at the courthouse across the square. "Good. I want them to know." "That's going to make them push harder," Gideon said. "I know." She turned and walked toward the truck. "Let them. Every move they make now is in response to mine. That means they're already playing catch-up." Tip. The call from Raymond Cutler came at 4:30 while she was on the highway back from town. "Pete Sievert found the letter," Cutler said. She could hear paper shuffling in the background. "He's scanning it now. And I've been in contact with the Federal Land Fraud Division in Helena. I have a colleague there, a woman named Stacy Wren, who's been watching certain property transfer patterns in western Montana for the past 2 years." A pause. "Maeve, she already has Pinnacle land holdings on a watch list. She just didn't have enough to move on." Maeve kept her eyes on the road. "Until now?" The access log from Harold Finch, Ellen Marsh's documentation, Pete Sievert's letter, your ledger, the forensic examiner I've engaged, she can have a preliminary comparison of the signatures ready within 48 hours. Another pause. "If Ellen Marsh drives those documents to my office tomorrow morning and Pete's scan comes through clean, we have enough for Stacy Wren to open a formal federal investigation." "How long does that take to get protection on the property?" "If Stacy files an emergency injunction, which she has told me she is prepared to do, it can happen within 24 hours of her opening the case." Maeve did the math. The 72-hour deadline Hutchins had given her would expire tomorrow night. The injunction would need to be in place before then, or she would be spending tomorrow night watching Pinnacle's men on her property with legal uncertainty on her side and their trucks on her land. "What do I do if they show up before the injunction?" she asked. "Don't leave the property," Cutler said. "Don't let them in. Call me immediately and call the state police, not the county sheriff, the state police. And document everything. Every vehicle, every person, every word spoken." "Understood." "One more thing." He paused. "Stacy Wren wants to know if you'd be willing to be a named plaintiff in a federal case if it comes to that. Not just fighting your own foreclosure, the whole pattern. Multiple properties, multiple victims, the county land office connection." The highway ran straight ahead of her into the late afternoon sky. She could see the turn for her own road in the distance. "Tell her yes," Maeve said. Well, Ellen Marsh arrived at Raymond Cutler's billings office the following morning with 3 cardboard file boxes stacked in the back of her pickup and the expression of a woman who has been waiting for this moment for 18 months and is not going to waste it. Maeve knew this because Ellen called her from the parking garage and described all of it, including the expression, with the brisk factual clarity of someone who'd had too many feelings for too long and had learned to channel them into information. 3 boxes, Maeve repeated. "Every piece of paper," Ellen said. And the letter they sent threatening her with county action. The same language Pete Sievert described. The same phrasing. I think it's a template. Which meant Garrett Voss, operations director, had a playbook, a script, a process for taking land from grieving people that had been refined enough to become a template. Maeve thought about that while she sat in her kitchen waiting for the day to start, and then she wrote it in her notebook because writing things down was how she kept the anger from becoming the kind of thing that made you stupid. Pete Sievert's scan came through at 9:17. Raymond Cutler called her at 9:45. "The letter is authentic," he said, "and the threatening language matches Ellen's almost word for word. Stacy Wren has seen both, and she is filing this morning." The federal injunction protecting the Holloway Ranch came through at 4:12 in the afternoon, 1 hour and 48 minutes before Hutchins' 72-hour deadline expired. Maeve was standing in her kitchen when Cutler called to tell her. She was holding a dish towel she'd been in the middle of using when the phone rang. She stood there with the dish towel in her hand and listened to Cutler read her the relevant language, which meant that Pinnacle Land Holdings, LLC, and all affiliated parties were prohibited from taking any action against the Holloway property pending the outcome of a federal investigation into land fraud in Cutler County, Montana. "Okay," she said when he finished. "That's all you've got?" Cutler said. He sounded almost amused, which was the closest she'd heard him come to it. "I'm standing here with a dish towel," she said. "Give me a minute." She put the dish towel down. She sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd opened the fireproof box, where she'd written the first 2 lines in the notebook, where she'd eaten half a sandwich and made calls until midnight. The notebook was still there, open to the latest page, which now had 14 items on it. She picked up a pen and crossed off the line that said 72-hour deadline. She did not feel like celebrating. What she felt was more like the particular relief of putting down something very heavy after carrying it a long way. Not happiness, exactly, not yet, because there was still too much ahead. But the first wall. The first wall was down. Hutchins' men arrived at 6:45 that evening anyway. 2 trucks, same as the first morning. They came up the gravel drive in the fading light, and Maeve was on the porch before they'd parked, with the rifle in the crook of her arm and her phone in her other hand and the copy of the federal injunction in her jacket pocket. Hutchins climbed out of the black truck. He looked at the rifle. He looked at her face. Something in his expression that had always been smooth went slightly sideways. "Mrs. Holloway," he said. "Your deadline has been superseded by a federal injunction," she said. She pulled the document from her pocket and held it out toward him, not offering it, just showing it. "Filed today at 4:12 by the Federal Land Fraud Division out of Helena. You're welcome to call your attorney and confirm." He didn't take the document. He looked at it from 10 feet away with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Part anger, part something else. Something that looked like the first moment a man realizes the situation is not what he thought it was. "This isn't over," he said. "No," Maeve agreed. "It isn't." She lowered the rifle slightly but didn't put it away. "But you need to leave my property right now, because the next call I make is to the state police, and the one after that is to Stacy Wren at the Federal Land Fraud Division, and I have her direct number saved in my phone, and she has been waiting all day for a reason to call Dale Hutchins a person of interest." She watched him process that, watched him decide. He got back in the truck. The trucks went back down the gravel drive. She stood on the porch and watched until the taillights disappeared. Behind her, she heard the sound of a truck she recognized. Gideon's, coming up from the east pasture where he'd been working the fence line all afternoon. He'd been there when the injunction came through and she'd told him. And he'd gone back to the fence without ceremony because the fence still needed finishing, and that was how he dealt with things. She was learning. He stopped the truck and rolled down the window. "They gone?" "They're gone." He looked at her for a moment in the last of the evening light, and then he nodded and rolled the window back up and finished parking. She watched him get out and go to the barn. To check the new latch, she assumed, the one he'd installed in the dark 2 nights ago. She stood on the porch a moment longer. The meadowlark had stopped for the night. The creek was running the way it always did. Somewhere in the middle distance, a coyote said something to the dark. She went inside. She opened the notebook to a fresh page. The injunction was real. The federal investigation was real. But Hutchins had said this isn't over, and she believed him, which meant she had something no longer than a breathing space, not a victory. She had bought time. What she did with it mattered. She wrote at the top of the new page, "Who is above Hutchins? Who is above Voss? Who owns Pinnacle?" She drew a box around it. The answer to that question was the thing that would determine whether this ended as a civil case or something larger. Whether a handful of families got some measure of justice for stolen land, or whether the whole machine got taken apart, piece by piece, down to the people who had built it and the officials who had let it run. She thought about what Rowena had said. Make the cost of burying it higher than the cost of losing. She thought about the 3 boxes Ellen Marsh had carried into Raymond Cutler's office. She thought about Harold Finch's voice on the phone. 8 months of fear compressed into one diner booth and a folded piece of paper. She thought about Pete Sievert in Tucson tearing apart his garage at midnight to find a letter he should never have had to keep in the first place. She was angry. She had been angry since the morning Hutchins nailed that notice to her door, but it had been a cold anger, a useful anger, the kind that doesn't make noise but keeps you moving forward in a straight line. She'd been grateful for that. Thomas had always said she was the most useful kind of angry, not hot enough to be reckless, not cold enough to give up. She missed him with a sharpness that surprised her even now, when she'd thought she'd at least gotten used to the shape of it. She picked up the pen. Underneath the boxed question, she wrote 4 words. Follow the money up. She drew a line from those words to Voss's name, then from Voss to Hutchins. Then above Voss, she drew a blank box with a question mark. That blank box was the next thing. Everything she'd done in the last 4 days had been defense, holding the line, collecting proof, buying time. The injunction gave her room to breathe, but it didn't give her the answer to what was in that box. For that, she was going to need to go on offense. She looked at the blank box for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Raymond Cutler at his home number, which he had given her specifically for emergencies. And when he answered, she said, I need to know everything there is to know about who actually owns Pinnacle Land Holdings. Corporate filings, parent companies, registered agents, all of it. A pause. Then I'll have my paralegal on it first thing. Tonight, she said, please. Another pause, longer. Then he said, I'll make some calls. She hung up and looked at the blank box with the question mark and thought about the man behind it. Whoever had decided that the grief of ordinary people was a business opportunity, whoever had built a system out of forged signatures and corrupted officials and 72-hour deadlines designed to catch exhausted widows before they could think clearly enough to fight back. She thought about what it would feel like to know his name. She thought, soon. Raymond Cutler's paralegal was a 26-year-old named Jesse, who apparently did not sleep and had opinions about corporate filing structures the way other people had opinions about sports teams. By 7 the next morning, he had sent Cutler a 14-page memo, and by 7:15, Cutler had called Maeve and read her the parts that mattered. Pinnacle Land Holdings, LLC was registered in Delaware, which meant almost nothing on its own because everything was registered in Delaware. But Pinnacle was a subsidiary of a holding company called Meridian Resource Group, which was itself a subsidiary of a private equity firm based in Scottsdale, Arizona called Vantage Western Capital. The registered agent for all 3 entities was the same law firm. The managing partner of that law firm had, 7 years ago, represented a man named Conrad Hale in a securities dispute in federal court. Conrad Hale was the chairman of Vantage Western Capital. He's the box, Maeve said. He's the box, Cutler confirmed. Conrad Hale, 61 years old, Scottsdale address, board memberships in 4 different resource acquisition companies. Clean record, nothing criminal, a few civil settlements that were sealed. He is very careful and very well insulated. But he owns the company that owns the company that owns Pinnacle. 3 shells deep, yes, which is not illegal by itself. The question is whether we can establish that he had knowledge of and directed the fraudulent activity at the Pinnacle level. Cutler paused. That is a harder case to make than the one against Hutchins and Voss. But Stacy Wren is looking at it. Stacy Wren is very interested in Conrad Hale, Cutler said, in the precise tone of a man choosing his words carefully. She has been, apparently, for some time. For reasons she has not fully disclosed to me, but which I interpret as meaning this is not the first instance of this kind of activity connected to his companies. Maeve stood at the kitchen window with her coffee. The east pasture was catching the early morning light, and the new fence posts Gideon had set were straight and solid, and she noticed them the way she noticed everything he fixed. Not with gratitude exactly, not yet, but with the particular awareness of someone who was beginning to understand that competence offered freely was its own kind of language. What does Stacy Wren need from me? She asked. She wants to meet, in person. She's driving down from Helena on Friday. 3 days. Tell her to come to the ranch, Maeve said. I want her to see it. The harassment started on Wednesday. It was small at first, which she later understood was intentional, small enough to be deniable, large enough to be felt. A vehicle parked at the end of her drive from midnight until 4 in the morning, not on her property, just visible. A phone call at 2 a.m. with nothing on the other end but breathing. Her mailbox knocked down overnight, which could have been an accident except that it had stood for 19 years through every windstorm the Bitterroot Range had produced. She documented everything: time, description, notes. She called Cutler. Cutler called Stacy Wren. Wren filed a harassment report with the state police. The state police sent a car to drive past twice a night, which helped with the parked vehicle but did nothing about the phone calls or the mailbox or the feeling Maeve was becoming familiar with of being watched from a distance by someone who wanted her to know she was being watched. She told Gideon about it on Wednesday morning, not because she needed him to do anything, but because he was there, and she had gotten used to saying things out loud to someone who listened without fixing them. "You sleeping?" he asked. "Some." That's not an answer. 3-4 hours. She looked at him. "I'm fine." He looked back at her with the expression she had come to recognize as his version of skepticism, which was not very different from his version of any other emotion. Quiet, patient, slightly exasperating. "You're running on adrenaline and coffee," he said, "which works until it doesn't." "I'll sleep after Friday." "You said that about the injunction. Then you said it about the corporate filing results." He picked up his coffee from the fence post where he'd set it. "I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I'm telling you what I see." "I know what you're doing," she said. She wasn't annoyed exactly. It was more like being seen at an angle she hadn't expected. "Thank you," she added, because it seemed like the right thing, and she was trying to say the right things more often. He nodded, changed the subject, which she also appreciated. "The north water line has a slow leak about 200 yards past the stock tank. Found it yesterday. I can fix it today if you want." "How bad?" "Bad enough to matter by August." "Fix it," she said, "and I'll pay you for the parts." He started to say something and she held up a hand. "I'll pay you for the parts," she said again. "That's not negotiable." He closed his mouth. "Fine," he said. They were negotiating the boundaries of something neither of them had named yet, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. The second thing that happened on Wednesday was worse than the mailbox. She was in town at the hardware store picking up wire connectors when she ran into Sheriff Briggs near the entrance. He saw her and did the thing she'd noticed him doing ever since the foreclosure notice. A slight recalibration of his expression, a beat too late, like a man deciding in real time how to position himself. "Maeve," he said, "heard there's been some activity out your way." "Someone parked at the end of my drive 3 nights running," she said. "State police have a report." "State police." He said it with a particular flatness that told her exactly how he felt about the state police being involved in a Cutler County matter. "You could have called me." "I could have," she agreed, and let the implication sit there without dressing it up. Briggs looked at her for a moment. He was not a stupid man, which was part of what made him difficult. Stupid, corrupt officials were easier to expose than careful ones. "I want you to know," he said, lowering his voice slightly, "that whatever history might exist between certain county officials and certain business interests, my office is not part of it." She looked at him. She was very tired, and she did not have patience for things that were probably true, but strategically convenient to say right now. "I hope that's right, Frank," she said, using his first name because they'd known each other long enough. "I genuinely hope that. But I'm going to keep the state police involved regardless." He held her gaze. "That's your right," he said. "For what it's worth. And I know it might not be worth much right now. If you need backup out there, county backup, you call me directly, not dispatch. Me." She thought about that offer for the rest of the day. It was either genuine or it was a way to keep tabs on what she knew. She couldn't tell which, and not being able to tell made her tired in a way that the phone calls and the parked vehicle and the mailbox had not. She mentioned it to Rowena that evening. Rowena considered it with the seriousness it deserved. "Frank Briggs has been sheriff for 14 years, she said. "He's taken money from developers before. Not illegally, campaign donations, the usual. But I've never heard anyone say Frank Briggs looked the other way on something violent or put someone in danger." She paused. "That doesn't mean he's clean. It means he might be the kind of man who draws lines in some places and not others. So I don't trust him, but I don't eliminate him." "I'd say that's right." Rowena refilled her coffee cup. How are you holding up? Honestly. Maeve thought about the question the way Gideon had asked a version of it that morning. She was tired of people asking, and she was also aware that the people asking were the ones paying attention. I'm holding, she said. I'm angry most of the time, which is useful. I miss Thomas in ways that catch me off guard, which is not useful, but I can't do anything about it. She wrapped both hands around her cup. I keep thinking about what he would say if he could see all of this. What do you think he'd say? She smiled without entirely meaning to. He'd say we'll figure it out, and then he'd go fix a fence and expect me to have a plan by the time he got back. Rowena laughed. A real laugh, short and warm. He wasn't wrong about you. No, Maeve said. He was right about that one thing, at least. Stacy Wren arrived on Friday morning in a government sedan that had seen better days and a pantsuit that had also seen better days, which made Maeve like her immediately. She was 44 or so, compact and precise in her movements, with sharp dark eyes that took in the ranch property in a sweep that felt professional rather than curious. She shook Maeve's hand on the porch and accepted coffee without ceremony, and sat down at the kitchen table like she'd been in working kitchens her whole life. She had a briefcase and a legal pad, and she wrote fast. I'm going to be direct with you, Stacy Wren said, before she'd even opened the briefcase. Conrad Hale is someone we have been building a case against for 4 years. The land fraud operation in Montana is one piece of a larger pattern that extends into Wyoming, Idaho, and eastern Oregon. We have suspected a systematic operation for 2 years. We did not have enough connected documentation to move. She looked at Maeve steadily. What you have given us, what you and Ellen Marsh and Harold Finch and Pete Sievert have given us, is the connective tissue we were missing. Maeve set down her coffee cup. How many properties? In Montana alone, we currently have evidence suggesting 11 properties fraudulently transferred over 6 years. We expect that number to grow as the investigation expands access to county records. Stacy Wren paused. Across all 4 states, our preliminary estimate is closer to 40. 40 families. 40 sets of forged signatures. 40 properties that had been taken from people who were already grieving or already scared. People who had been targeted specifically because their paperwork was accessible and their resistance was assumed to be low. Tell me about Conrad Hale, Maeve said. Stacy Wren opened her briefcase. She put a photograph on the table. A man in his early 60s, silver-haired, the kind of face that appeared in business journals alongside words like visionary and acquisitive. He looked like someone who gave speeches at chambers of commerce. He looked like someone who had been told his whole life that he was exceptional and had never found a reason to disagree. Conrad Hale built Vantage Western Capital 18 years ago on legitimate land acquisitions in Nevada and Utah, Stacy said. Ranches, mining rights, water rights. He was aggressive but not illegal, and he was very good at identifying undervalued property and waiting. About 8 years ago, the model shifted. We don't know exactly when the decision was made to begin manufacturing distressed situations rather than simply finding them. She tapped the photograph. What we believe is that Garrett Voss, his operations director, developed the system. The shell companies, the county official relationships, the document forgery protocol. Hale kept himself 3 corporate layers away from the execution. But he knew, Maeve said. It wasn't a question. We believe he knew. Proving it is the challenge. Stacy Wren folded her hands on the table. Here's what I need from you. Your testimony about the signature discrepancy and your recognition of your husband's handwriting gives us a human anchor, a specific victim who can speak to the specific fraud with specificity and credibility. Ellen Marsh gives us a second. Pete Sievert gives us a third. Harold Finch gives us the inside corroboration. She paused. But I also need you to be prepared for what a federal case of this size will involve. The defense will attack your credibility, your grief, your motives. They will suggest the lawsuit is financially motivated. They will investigate your background, your marriage, your finances going back 20 years. They will try to make you feel like the criminal. Let them, Maeve said. Stacy Wren looked at her. You understand what I'm saying. I understand exactly what you're saying. Maeve put both hands on the table. I have 19 years of ledger records. I have an original deed and unbroken tax filings. I have a forensic document examiner confirming the signature discrepancy. I have no financial motive beyond recovering my own property. And I have been a widow for 5 months while someone tried to steal the only thing my husband and I built together. She met Stacy Wren's eyes. I am not afraid of being questioned. Stacy Wren made a note on her legal pad. She was quiet for a moment. I want to bring someone else to meet you, she said. Next week, if you're willing. A woman named Carla Dustin. She lost her ranch in eastern Montana 2 years ago. She was one of the first we identified, but she signed a settlement agreement with a non-disclosure clause that made her unavailable to us legally. She paused. That clause becomes void if a federal criminal investigation supersedes the civil settlement, which this one now does. Maeve said, "Give me her number, I'll call her myself." I was hoping you'd say that. Stacy Wren slid a business card across the table with a number written on the back. She's been waiting for someone to call who had actually found a way through. The forensic report arrived Thursday of the following week, 10 days after Maeve had first walked into Raymond Cutler's office in Billings. The examiner was a woman named Dr. Patricia Wolfe, who had testified in federal court 16 times and had a way of writing reports that made the complex exactly as simple as it needed to be without losing precision. The report was 41 pages. The conclusion was 2 sentences. The questioned signatures on the Pinnacle Land Holdings loan documents exhibit significant divergence from the known signatures of Thomas Allen Holloway in multiple identifying characteristics, including baseline angle, pressure pattern, letter formation in the uppercase H, and the presence of a compensatory rightward hook in the downstrokes of known samples, which is entirely absent in the questioned documents. It is the opinion of this examiner, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty, that the questioned signatures were not produced by Thomas Allen Holloway. Maeve read those 2 sentences 3 times. Then she called Raymond Cutler and said, "We have it." "I know," he said. "Dr. Wolfe sent me the report simultaneously. I've already forwarded it to Stacy Wren." A pause. "Maeve, this is the cornerstone. Everything else builds on this." She was sitting at the kitchen table. Thomas's ledger was still there, open to the pages she had been referencing for the past week and a half. She looked at his handwriting, all those columns of numbers, all those dates, 19 years of his particular hand with its particular hook, its particular lean, all the small physical signatures of a life spent writing things down carefully. She put her hand flat on the open page. "I know," she said. What? Conrad Hale made his first direct move 8 days after the federal investigation went active. It didn't come from Hutchins. It didn't come from Voss. It came in the form of a letter delivered by private courier to Raymond Cutler's office, on letterhead from a law firm in Phoenix that occupied 2 full floors of a building Maeve had never heard of, proposing a settlement that would restore full title to the Holloway Ranch, compensate Maeve for legal fees and emotional distress at a number that had more zeros than she had expected, and require in exchange her withdrawal from the federal case and a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement covering all matters related to Pinnacle Land Holdings, Meridian Resource Group, and Vantage Western Capital. Cutler called her the moment the courier left his office. He read her the settlement figure. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Maeve, no," she said again. "Read me the non-disclosure language." He read it. It was comprehensive. It would have covered Ellen Marsh, Harold Finch, Pete Sievert, Carla Dustin, every other family they'd identified, every piece of evidence, everything. If she signed it, the federal case against Conrad Hale would lose its named plaintiff and its anchor testimony, and would almost certainly be significantly weakened. "They're not trying to give me my ranch back," she said when he finished. "They're trying to buy their way out of what's coming." "That is an accurate reading of the situation, yes." "How much does this settlement offer tell you about how scared they are?" A pause. She could hear Cutler thinking, which was a small sound, a kind of focused stillness on his end of the line. "It tells me they are scared enough to spend significant money to make this disappear," he said. "It also tells me they believe they still have enough leverage that the offer might be attractive." "What leverage?" "A federal case of this complexity takes time, potentially years. During that time, you will be under sustained attack from their legal team, your personal life will be scrutinized, and you will be living with uncertainty." He paused again. I'm not recommending the settlement. I want to be clear about that. I'm explaining why they think you might take it. Maeve looked out the kitchen window. The east pasture fence was straight and solid. The barn latch held, the water line was fixed. The ranch was hers, protected by a federal injunction, and she had 5 months of grief and 4 days of anger and 10 days of evidence in her, and she was being offered money to stop. I want you to draft a response, she said. Professional, no gloating. Tell them the named plaintiff is not available for settlement discussions at this time, and that all future communication should be directed to federal counsel. I'll have it to them by end of day. And Raymond, she stopped. Yes? Tell Stacy Wren they made an offer. She should know they're feeling the pressure. Already drafted that email, he said. Carla Dustin drove up from her daughter's place in Billings on a Tuesday, and Maeve met her at the door and knew her immediately. Not from a photograph, there had been no photograph, but from the way she carried herself. Carla was 58, heavier than she'd probably been 2 years ago, with the specific set to her jaw of someone who had agreed to something they regretted, and had been living with the weight of it ever since. They sat at the kitchen table. Maeve made coffee. She put Thomas's ledger to the side but didn't close it. Carla looked at the ledger. Your husband's? Yes. Carla nodded. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. Mine kept records too. Not like that, but he kept records. She looked at Maeve. I signed their papers because my youngest was sick, and I had no money, and they told me if I fought it, I'd spend 2 years in court and lose everything anyway. She said it without self-pity, which was somehow harder to hear than self-pity would have been. I have thought about it every day since. The non-disclosure doesn't hold anymore, Maeve said. Stacy Wren confirmed it this morning. Carla looked at her. Something moved behind her eyes, complicated, layered, the look of someone who has held a door shut for a long time and is now being told she can open it. I know, she said. Stacy called me too. A pause. I kept copies of everything, same as Ellen. I hid them in a storage unit in Billings before I signed the settlement because I didn't entirely trust myself not to lose them in a weak moment. She put her coffee cup down. I want to testify. Tell me what happened, Maeve said. From the beginning, all of it. Carla told her. It took 2 hours. The details differed from Maeve's story in the specifics and were identical to it in the pattern. The death of a spouse, the waiting period, the approach, the forged documents, the impossible deadline, the pressure, the settlement that had been designed to look like the only door in a locked room. When Carla finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I used to think I was weak because I signed, that if I'd been stronger. You were alone, Maeve said. You had a sick child and no money and no attorney and no one who knew what you knew. There was nothing weak about it. They designed it to be unanswerable. Carla looked at her. Her jaw was doing something complicated. How are you not... She stopped. Tried again. How are you not falling apart? Maeve thought about it honestly. I am falling apart, she said. Just in pieces small enough to keep moving. She looked at her coffee. I talked to my neighbor Rowena, and there's a man who fixes things on the property who I don't entirely know what to make of, but he's there. She paused. And I'm angry. I stay angry enough that the falling apart doesn't get ahead of the forward motion. Carla half laughed, which was clearly something she hadn't expected to do today. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 2 years. They sat there for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have been through different versions of the same thing and recognize each other across it. When this goes to trial, Maeve said, they are going to put us both on a stand and try to make us look like confused, grieving women who misunderstood a legal process. I know. Are you ready for that? Carla picked up her coffee. Her jaw was still set. I have been ready for 2 years, she said. I just didn't have anywhere to aim it. The next blow came from a direction Maeve hadn't fully prepared for. 10 days after the settlement offer was rejected, a story appeared in the Cutler Courier, the local paper, the same one that had once run a photo of Hutchins at Briggs's campaign fundraiser. The story was on the front page below the fold, under a headline that read, Questions Surround Holloway Ranch Federal Case. The piece was vague enough to be technically accurate and pointed enough to be damaging. It raised unnamed questions about Thomas Holloway's financial management in the final year of his life. It mentioned, as if incidentally, that the federal case had not yet resulted in any charges. It quoted an unnamed source described as a legal observer who suggested the case appeared to be driven by personal grief rather than substantive legal grounds. It did not name Conrad Hale. It did not mention the 11 Montana properties or the 40 across 4 states. It did not mention Harold Finch or Ellen Marsh or Pete Sievert or the forensic report from Dr. Patricia Wolfe. Maeve read it at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning with her second cup of coffee and her blood running cold and steady. Gideon had seen it too. He was at the barn when she came out, and he said nothing about it, but she could see in his face that he'd read it. "Say it," she said. "I'm not going to say it." "Say it anyway." He looked at her. "They're coming after Thomas now," he said, "because they can't come after you directly anymore." Her throat tightened, just for a moment. Then it passed. "I know. How do you want to handle it?" She had been thinking about that since the moment she read it. "I'm not going to issue a statement through Cutler's office," she said. "I'm not going to respond through the newspaper. That's what they want. They want me defensive, explaining, justifying Thomas." She set her jaw. "What I'm going to do is call every family we've identified, all 11 in Montana, and I'm going to ask each one to send a written statement to Stacy Wren confirming their experience. 11 statements, 11 names, dated this week in direct response to this story." She looked at Gideon. "Let them explain 11 statements to a federal investigator while a forensic report is sitting in the case file." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking like a lawyer," he said. "I've been thinking like someone who has no choice," she said. It came out more tired than she intended. She took a breath. "They wrote that story to make me flinch, to make me feel like Thomas is being questioned and I should be protecting him." She looked out at the pasture. "Thomas doesn't need protecting. He's got 19 years of clean ledger books and an original deed and a handwriting expert who confirmed he never signed their papers. The best thing I can do for Thomas's name is finish this." Gideon put his coffee cup down on the fence post. He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read as him deciding something. "I want to help with the phone calls," he said. "Not make them. But if you're calling 11 families, you're going to be on the phone for 2 days straight, and you should eat at some point. Let me be here while you do it." She looked at him, at this man who had shown up uninvited to fix her fence and had not left, who fixed water lines and barn latches and fence posts and now apparently intended to make sure she ate while she was building a federal case. She understood suddenly, with the kind of clarity that comes from being tired enough for your defenses to lapse slightly, that she had let him in without noticing she was doing it. That somewhere between the rifle in the barn and the late-night conversation about Pete Sievert in Tucson, she had stopped being suspicious of his presence and started relying on it, and that this scared her more than Dale Hutchins and Conrad Hale combined, because at least with them she knew exactly what they wanted. "Okay," she said. It was a smaller word than everything it carried. He nodded. He didn't make anything of it. He picked up his coffee and went back to the barn. She went inside and opened her notebook and started on the list of calls. The calls took 2 days, as he had predicted. 11 families. Some took the call in 5 minutes, grateful and ready. Some took an hour, frightened and uncertain, needing to hear the shape of the case laid out for them in language they could believe in. One woman cried for 10 minutes and then said yes. One man said he needed to call his lawyer first and called back 6 hours later and said yes. By the end of the second day, she had 11 written statements committed and 9 of them already submitted to Stacy Wren's office. She had drunk more coffee than was reasonable and eaten sandwiches that appeared at the kitchen table at intervals she hadn't tracked, and when she finally closed the notebook and looked up, it was dark outside, and Gideon was sitting across the table reading a water rights document he'd brought from his own place, and the kitchen was warm and the clock was counting, and she thought, Thomas would have liked this man. She did not say it out loud. She stored it somewhere careful. "Done?" he said, without looking up from his document. "Done," she said. He closed the document. "You should sleep." "I know." "More than 4 hours." "I know," she said again, without committing to it. He stood up. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. He paused at the kitchen door. "That newspaper story," he said. It didn't work. No. They know that now, too. He looked at her, which means they're going to try something else. I know, she said for the third time. He held her gaze for a moment, that steady, quiet regard that she had stopped finding exasperating and started finding, she reluctantly admitted to herself, something closer to steadying. I'll be back in the morning, he said. Before 7, she said. Before 7, he agreed, and went out into the dark. She sat alone at the kitchen table with the notebook closed in front of her, and the 11 committed statements and Thomas's ledger and the forensic report, and the rejected settlement offer, and the names of 40 families in 4 states, and the blank box above Voss's name in her notebook that now had Conrad Hale written in it in firm, certain letters. She thought about what Gideon had said. They're going to try something else. She thought about the shape of Conrad Hale's operation, careful, layered, insulated. A man who had spent 8 years making sure nothing touched him directly. A man who had offered her money when evidence threatened him and then attacked Thomas's reputation when money didn't work. A man who was running out of moves. She opened the notebook to the last page. She looked at the blank box with Conrad Hale's name in it, and below it the web of lines connecting Voss to Hutchins to Prieger, to the accessed land records, to the forged documents, to 11 families in Montana and 40 across 4 states. She wrote one line underneath it all. He's going to come at the witnesses. She circled it. Then she picked up the phone and called Stacy Wren. Stacy Wren did not seem surprised when Maeve called at 10:30 at night to tell her Conrad Hale was going to come after the witnesses. I've been expecting it, Stacy said. The settlement rejection told them the legal route is closed. The newspaper story didn't land. That leaves intimidation. A pause. I'm moving up the timeline on protective measures. Harold Finch and Ellen Marsh are the most exposed. Finch, because he's the inside witness. Marsh, because she has the most documentation. I'm going to recommend both of them have contact with our office daily until the hearing date is set. What about Carla Dustin? Carla, too, and Pete Seivert, even in Tucson. Another pause. Maeve, I want you to be careful, not paranoid, just careful. The harassment you've already experienced was low level. If they escalate, I have a rifle and I know how to use it, Maeve said. Stacy was quiet for a moment. I was going to say call me immediately, but yes, also that. The hearing date came through 12 days later, a federal courtroom in Billings, 6 weeks out. The case had formally expanded from a civil dispute over one ranch into a federal criminal fraud case with Vantage Western Capital, Meridian Resource Group, Pinnacle Land Holdings, Conrad Hale, Garrett Voss, Dale Hutchins, and Douglas Prager all listed as defendants or persons of interest. Stacy Wren's office had worked fast, which Raymond Cutler told Maeve was unusual, and which Maeve interpreted as meaning Stacy had been building toward this moment for longer than any of them had known. The night she learned the hearing date, Maeve sat at the kitchen table with the notebook open and looked at every page she had filled since the morning Hutchins nailed that notice to her door. 22 pages. Names, dates, connections, questions she'd answered and questions she hadn't. The box with Conrad Hale's name in it. The line that said, follow the money up. The first 2 lines she'd ever written, signatures don't match. Find originals. She thought about how 6 weeks ago she had been a woman who wasn't sleeping and wasn't eating properly and was talking to her dead husband in an empty kitchen. She was still not sleeping enough. She was still talking to Thomas sometimes, though less often now. And when she did, it felt less like loss and more like consultation, which was different in a way she couldn't entirely articulate but felt clearly. She was also, she realized, no longer doing this alone. She wasn't sure when that had changed. It had happened gradually, in the way most real things do. Not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of small ones. Rowena and her address book, Ellen Marsh and her 3 boxes of files, Harold Finch in the diner with a folded piece of paper, Carla Dustin and 2 years of waiting. Pete Seivert tearing apart his Tucson garage at midnight, Raymond Cutler and his paralegal Jesse, who didn't sleep, Stacy Wren and 4 years of building towards something she now had the evidence to finish. And Gideon. Who was at the east fence again in the morning, or in the barn, or drinking coffee at her kitchen table with a water rights document, who had been quietly present through all of it, without asking her to be grateful or explain herself or be anything other than exactly what she was. She wrote one last thing on the final page of the notebook. I did not do this alone. And that's not weakness. That's the whole point. She closed the notebook. But Conrad Hale made his move against the witnesses 9 days before the hearing. It was not dramatic. That was the thing about men like Hale. They had learned to do damage in ways that didn't look like damage until you were already bleeding. He didn't threaten Harold Finch directly. What happened was that Harold's son, who worked for a construction firm in Missoula, was called in by his supervisor and told the firm was losing a major contract with a company called Meridian Resource Group unless certain staffing changes were made. Harold's son called Harold. Harold called Maeve at 7 in the morning, his voice tight and controlled in the way of a man who is angry and frightened simultaneously. They went after my boy, he said. Maeve sat down. Is he okay? He hasn't been let go yet. They're giving him until Friday. Harold's voice cracked slightly on the last word, then steadied. I want you to know I'm not backing out. I'm telling you this because you said to tell you everything. I know, she said. Harold, you call Stacy Wren right now. This is witness intimidation in a federal case. This is exactly the kind of thing that makes their situation worse, not better. A silence. You sure? I am absolutely sure. She gripped the phone. Do not let them make you quiet by going around you. That is exactly what they are counting on. She called Stacy before Harold had even hung up. Stacy was already moving. She had apparently been monitoring for exactly this kind of lateral pressure and had a contact at the FBI's Organized Crime Division who took the call within the hour. By Wednesday, 2 days before Harold's son's Friday deadline, a federal investigator had contacted the construction firm with questions about Meridian Resource Group's business practices, and the implied personnel pressure evaporated the way smoke does when you open a window. Harold's son kept his job. Harold Finch showed up at Maeve's kitchen door 2 days later with a jar of honey from his wife's hives and the expression of a man who had been scared and had not let the fear make his decisions. He sat down and drank coffee and said, I underestimated you. Most people do, Maeve said, and meant it without bitterness. I mean, I underestimated what you were building, he said. When I called you, I thought I was handing you one piece of information. I didn't understand it was going to turn into... He gestured vaguely. Neither did I, she said honestly. I was trying to save a fence and a signature. The rest of it found me. He looked at her for a moment. Your husband would be proud, he said, and she knew he meant it, and she accepted it for what it was. A simple, true thing said by a man who had risked something and come through the other side of it. He would also tell me the barn needs paint, she said. Harold laughed. It surprised both of them. The federal courtroom in Billings was larger than Maeve had expected, and colder, the air conditioning running at a temperature that seemed designed to keep everyone slightly uncomfortable. She arrived early with Raymond Cutler and found Stacy Wren already there, along with 3 members of her team and a man from the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit who had flown in from Denver. Ellen Marsh arrived 20 minutes later with her daughter. Carla Dustin came with her own attorney, a young woman from Billings who had taken the case at reduced fees because she was the kind of lawyer who still believed in that occasionally. Harold Finch came alone in his best suit, looking like a man who had made peace with something. Pete Sievert had flown in from Tucson. He was 81 years old and walked with a cane and sat down in the gallery with the posture of someone who had decided this was worth the plane ticket and the bad knee and the everything else. Maeve saw him when she came in and stopped. You didn't have to come in person, she said. I know I didn't, he said. He looked at her with old, sharp eyes. Gideon tell you I was the one who suggested he check on you? After I heard about your situation from some friends in the county? She went still. Pete smiled, small, a little tired. He drove out to see me before I went to Tucson, told me about the property next to yours. I told him what I knew about Pinnacle. He paused. He's a good man. Doesn't know what to do with that sometimes, but he's good. Maeve stood in the aisle of the federal courtroom and thought about Gideon riding past her dying fence line, and whether that had been entirely accidental, and what it meant that it might not have been, and decided she would think about that later. Not here, not now. "Thank you for coming, Pete," she said. "Wouldn't miss it," he said simply. She found her seat at the plaintiff's table and set her folder down and looked at the room. The defense side was full. 4 attorneys from the Phoenix firm, 2 from a Billings firm they had brought in locally, and somewhere behind them a man she recognized from the photograph Stacy Wren had placed on her kitchen table. Conrad Hale, silver-haired, in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly expenses, sitting with the composed expression of a man who had sat in rooms like this before and always left through the right door. He was not looking at her. She looked at him anyway. She thought, "You targeted women who had just lost everything because you believed they would be too broken to fight back." She thought, "You were wrong about that. You have been wrong about that for 8 years across 4 states and 40 families, and you are still wrong about it today, sitting in this room that your own actions built around you." She opened her folder. The proceedings began. Mom. The defense strategy was exactly what Raymond Cutler had predicted and what Stacy Wren had warned her about. In their opening, the Phoenix attorneys painted Pinnacle Land Holdings as a legitimate business that had been drawn into a legally complex situation by a grieving widow who had misunderstood documents and then assembled a collection of discontented former landowners around a narrative that confirmed what they wanted to believe. They were good at it. The language was smooth and the framing was precise, and if Maeve had not spent 7 weeks living inside the actual truth of what had happened, she might have found it almost persuasive. She watched the judge, a woman in her late 50s named the Honorable Frances Delacroix, who had the specific stillness of someone who has heard a great deal of well-constructed argument in her time and has learned to wait for the part that matters. Dr. Patricia Wolfe testified first. 41 pages of forensic report compressed into 40 minutes of testimony, delivered with the particular authority of someone who has no stake in the outcome except accuracy. The defense cross-examined her for an hour, trying to introduce doubt about her methodology and her conclusions. She answered every question with the same patient precision, and the doubt did not stick. Harold Finch testified next. He described the accessed land records, the maintenance request that accessed nothing, the conversation with Doug Prager, the early retirement offer. He was not a polished witness. He stumbled once, corrected himself, went back. That imperfection, Maeve thought, was its own kind of credibility. People who have been coached to testify sound coached. Harold Finch sounded like a man who had done something he was ashamed of and was trying, in the only way left to him, to correct it. The defense tried to characterize him as a disgruntled former employee seeking relevance. Harold looked at the attorney asking the question and said flatly, "I'm a retired county clerk who is telling you what I saw. You can characterize it however you want." Ellen Marsh testified about the double R. Carla Dustin testified about her ranch in eastern Montana. Pete Sievert testified, slowly and precisely, from the witness stand with his cane hooked over the railing, about the 3 visits, the intimidation language, the letter that had waited in a Phoenix garage for 2 years to be useful. Each testimony built on the last. Each one added a thread until the web was visible to anyone in the room willing to see it. Then Maeve testified. She had thought about this moment for 7 weeks. She had talked to Cutler about it, and to Stacy Wren, and once to Rowena, who had said simply, "Tell the truth in the order it happened, and don't let them rush you." She had not talked to Gideon about it, because some things she needed to hold in her own hands without anyone else's fingerprints on them. She described the morning Hutchins came. She described the signature and the missing hook and the downstrokes, and 19 years of watching Thomas write. She described the ledger and the missing loan proceeds and the fireproof box under the floorboard that Thomas had hidden with such satisfaction. She described Harold Finch in the diner. She described calling Raymond Cutler at 6:45 in the morning and what it had cost to write that retainer check and why she had written it anyway. The defense cross-examination came from the lead Phoenix attorney, a man named Gareth Moore, who was very good at making sympathy sound like an accusation. He suggested she had been overwhelmed by grief. He suggested the ledger records proved nothing because a man could take a loan without recording it. He suggested her certainty about the handwriting was the certainty of emotion rather than expertise. Maeve waited through each question until he was finished. She had learned that in this room specifically, patience was not passivity, it was discipline. Mr. Moore, she said, when he suggested her grief had colored her judgment, I have been grieving for 7 months. I have also, in those 7 months, retained a federal attorney, identified and documented 11 cases of land fraud in Montana, connected them to 40 cases across 4 states, obtained a forensic analysis that confirms my husband never signed those documents, and persuaded 6 separate individuals to testify at personal risk in a federal case. She looked at him steadily. Grief did not do that. Stubbornness did that. And the fact that those 2 things can exist in the same person at the same time is not a contradiction. It is the most ordinary thing in the world. The courtroom was quiet. Judge Delacroix was looking at Maeve with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Gareth Moore moved on to his next question. The moment that broke the case open, the moment that would be referenced in Stacey Wren's closing argument, and in Raymond Cutler's account of the trial, and in the brief article the Billings Gazette ran 3 days later, was not Maeve's testimony. It was Doug Prager's. Prager had been listed as a cooperating witness for the defense, which meant the Phoenix team had intended to use him to corroborate the legitimacy of the county land office's processes. What the Phoenix team had not known, what even Stacey Wren had not been certain of until the morning of the second day, was that Prager had spent the previous 3 weeks in conversation with the FBI's financial crimes investigator from Denver and had made a decision that had very little to do with loyalty and a great deal to do with the mathematics of his own situation. He took the stand for the defense and answered 3 questions and then said, unprompted, that he needed to correct the record on several matters he had previously characterized inaccurately. The Phoenix attorneys objected loudly. Judge Delacroix overruled with a brevity that suggested she had been waiting for exactly this. Prager described, in the flat, careful voice of a man who has made his peace with consequence, how the access to land records had worked, who had requested it, what Garrett Voss had told him it was for, how he had understood, without being told explicitly, that his cooperation was connected to his continued employment and his brother-in-law's continued business relationships with county-adjacent entities. How he had told Harold Finch the access was routine and recommended his early retirement because he was frightened and because he had a mortgage and 2 kids in college and because he had told himself it was a paperwork issue, not a people issue, until the morning he read about Maeve Holloway in the paper and understood it was always a people issue. He did not look at the defense table when he said any of this. He looked at Judge Delacroix and occasionally at his own hands, and once, briefly, for only a second, at Maeve. She held his gaze for that second. She did not nod. She did not smile. She simply acknowledged him, one person to another across a room that had just changed shape. Garrett Voss, whose attorney had been navigating a narrow line all morning, requested a recess immediately after Prager's testimony. The recess was granted. During the recess, according to Cutler, who learned it from Stacey, who was watching the defense table, Voss's attorney communicated to the federal prosecution that his client wished to explore cooperation terms. By the time court resumed, the shape of the thing was clear to everyone in the room. Conrad Hale sat at the defense table with his silver hair and his expensive suit and his composed expression, and he was the last man in the building still pretending the wall hadn't come down. Judge Delacroix ruled from the bench on the civil matter that afternoon. Full title to the Holloway Ranch was confirmed and federally protected. The foreclosure action was declared fraudulent and void. All documents filed by Pinnacle Land Holdings related to the alleged loan were ordered impounded as evidence in the criminal proceeding. The criminal matter, the fraud charges, the conspiracy charges, the charges related to witness intimidation that had been added when Meridian's pressure on Harold Finch's son came to light, was bound over for trial. Voss's cooperation agreement, formalized 2 days later, implicated Conrad Hale directly in the operational decisions of the scheme, including the specific decision to target recently widowed landowners in low-population counties, because according to internal communications that Voss surrendered as part of his agreement, they were statistically less likely to have immediate legal resources or community support networks. That phrase, statistically less likely to have immediate legal resources or community support networks, was the thing that stayed with Maeve longest afterward. Not the ruling, not the restored title, not even the criminal charges. It was the knowledge that she and Ellen and Carla and all the others had been selected not despite their vulnerability, but because of it. That someone had looked at grief and isolation and seen a margin. She thought about that a long time. She thought, and then we found each other, and the margin disappeared. The drive home from Billings took 2 hours, and she did it alone, which she had wanted. Cutler had offered to ride with her, and Stacy Wren had suggested a team debrief, and Ellen Marsh had asked her to dinner, and she had said no to all of it as gently as she could because she needed the 2 hours to be just her and the truck, and the highway opening up ahead in the early evening light. She thought about Thomas for most of it, not with the raw, grabbing grief of the early months, but with the quieter, fuller kind that she was learning was what love becomes when the person it was directed at is gone. It doesn't disappear, it just changes shape, becomes something you carry differently. She thought about what he would have said about Doug Prager's testimony and Voss's cooperation agreement and Conrad Hale's face in the courtroom. She thought he probably would have said something dry and precise that she would have laughed at and then repeated to Rowena later. She thought, I am okay. Not healed. She had stopped believing in healed as a destination. But okay, which was its own kind of solid ground. When she turned onto the gravel road and the tire tracks in the grass came up in her headlights, she saw that the light in the barn was on. Gideon's truck was parked at the fence. She pulled up and sat in her own truck for a moment before getting out. She could hear faintly the sound of something being worked on in the barn, the scrape of wood or metal, something being set right. He had apparently been here all day, and she had not asked him to be, and she found she was not surprised. She got out. She walked to the barn. He was inside replacing the rotted board on the south stall partition, the one she had meant to get to for 2 months, working in the yellow light with his back to the door. He turned when he heard her. She stood in the doorway. She did not say anything for a moment because she was not sure what the right thing to say was, and she had learned in 7 weeks that it was better to wait for the right words than fill the space with wrong ones. It went well, he said. Not a question. She thought he had probably heard something through the county grapevine, which operated faster than any newspaper. It went well, she confirmed. He looked at her for a long moment. The barn light was not flattering, and they were both tired, and she was aware that this was not a movie moment. There was sawdust on his shirt, and she had spent 2 days in a federal courtroom, and neither of them looked anything other than exactly what they were, which was, she thought, its own kind of right. Pete told me, she said, that you went to see him, that it wasn't entirely accidental you riding past the fence. He didn't look away. I heard about your situation before I introduced myself, he said. Pete described what Pinnacle had tried with him. When I heard the same thing was happening to you, I didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew I wasn't going to drive past. Why? He thought about that with the seriousness she had come to expect from him when she asked a real question. Because somebody didn't drive past for me once, he said, and I've been trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do with that ever since. You said the same thing to me on day 1. He paused. I think I finally figured it out. She looked at him. At this man who fixed things and showed up and didn't explain himself until she asked, and didn't ask anything of her she hadn't offered, who had been beside her without being in front of her through all of it. The barn looks better, she said. The south stall needed the board replaced. I figured while I was at it. I know. She pushed off the door frame. Are you staying for coffee? He set down the hammer. He considered the question with the same seriousness he considered everything. Yeah, he said, if that's all right. It's all right, she said. They walked to the house together across the grass in the dark, not touching, not saying anything, and the kitchen light was on the way it always was, and the clock was counting above the door, and the refrigerator hummed its reliable hum. She put the coffee on. She put the notebook on the table, the one that had started with signatures don't match. Find originals and ended with I did not do this alone. And that's not weakness. That's the whole point. She opened it to the last page and looked at that line for a moment. Then she took a fresh page and wrote at the top of it, What we build next. She sat there looking at those 3 words while the coffee brewed and Gideon sat across the table with his quiet, steady presence, and the ranch held itself around them, imperfect and stubborn and alive, the way it had always been, the way it was going to stay. Outside, the creek was running. The broken things were fixed. Not all of them. There would always be something else. Another board, another fence post, another thing that needed attention. That was what land was. That was what a life was. You fixed what you could. And you showed up for the things you couldn't fix alone. And you wrote down what you'd learned so you didn't have to relearn it from scratch. Maeve poured 2 cups of coffee. She did not feel like a woman who had won. She felt like a woman who had held her ground until the ground became something worth standing on again, which was, she had decided, the more honest version of the same thing. She thought about Carla Dustin driving home to her daughter's house with 2 years of waiting finally converted into something useful. She thought about Harold Finch and his jar of honey and the expression of a man who had corrected something he'd gotten wrong. She thought about Ellen Marsh and her 3 boxes and Pete Sievert on a plane from Tucson with his cane and his 81 years and his still useful fury. She thought, we were all supposed to be too alone to do this, and none of us were. That was the thing about being targeted for your grief and your isolation. It only worked if the grief stayed grief and the isolation stayed isolation. The moment you reached past it, the moment you called someone or drove somewhere or picked up the phone at 2 a.m. because you needed to say something out loud to a person who would listen, in that moment, the whole calculation fell apart. They had underestimated that. All of them, Hutchins and Voss and Conrad Hale in his expensive suit, they had looked at a list of widows in rural counties and seen weakness quantified, and they had not accounted for the possibility that weakness, handled correctly, has a way of becoming something else entirely. Maeve pushed one of the coffee cups across the table. Gideon picked it up. The creek ran on outside, and the Montana sky did what it always did. Went vast and dark and indifferent to anything that happened beneath it, the way it had since before any of them existed and would continue long after. And inside the kitchen, the clock ticked, and the coffee was hot, and the notebook was open to a new page with 3 words at the top of it. She picked up the pen. She was not sure yet what came after those 3 words. She thought probably something with the land. There was the East Field, unplanted since Thomas, which she had been looking at for 5 months like a thing she wasn't ready to think about. She thought about what Rowena had said once, years ago, about how grief was not the opposite of moving forward, but something you carried while you moved, until the carrying became ordinary and the moving became its own kind of meaning. She thought about the notebook full of names and evidence and questions answered and questions still open, and she thought, I know how to do this now. Not the legal case, that was done, or as done as anything legal ever is before the next motion, but the rest of it, the reaching out and the building and the refusing to let fear make the decisions. She knew how to do that now in a way she hadn't 7 weeks ago. Thomas had always said she was the one who figured things out. She had spent 19 years thinking that was his particular way of being generous about her stubbornness. She understood now it was just accurate. She wrote the second line under what we build next. Start with the East Field. She looked at it. Then she looked at Gideon across the table, who was drinking his coffee and not asking her what she was writing because he was that kind of person. The East Field, she said. I want to put it back into production this spring. I'm going to need help. He looked at her over the coffee cup. What kind of help? The kind that shows up before 7, she said. He set the cup down. He looked at the table. He looked back at her. Something in his face shifted. Not dramatic, just honest. The way his face was when he wasn't deciding what to show her. I'm not going anywhere, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded and looked back at the notebook. She didn't need him to say more than that, and he didn't. That was the thing she had learned about the people who were actually worth trusting. They didn't make large promises in important moments. They just told you the small, specific, true thing, and then showed up the next morning and proved it. She wrote the 3rd line. Don't do it alone. She underlined it once. Outside, the first edge of the Montana night settled fully over the Bitterroot Range, and the ranch held on beneath it. Not perfect, not healed, not finished, but standing, which was all it had ever needed to be.